At my only son's funeral, my daughter-in-law leaned her head on my shoulder for the flashing cameras. Everyone thought she was a grieving widow seeking comfort from her father-in-law. But then she pressed her lips to my ear and whispered something that froze the blood in my veins. She told me to stop my pathetic crying and gave me exactly 15 days to pack my bags and get out of her house. I did not yell. I did not cause a scene. I simply smiled, packed a single bag, and quietly walked away. She thought she had won. She thought the $50 million empire I built was finally hers, but she had no idea that the following morning, the people knocking on her door would not be delivering sympathy flowers. They would be federal agents with a warrant for her arrest. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Now let me take you back to how this nightmare began. My name is Gregory Mitchell. I am 70 years old. I spent 40 years of my life turning a beat-up pickup truck and a rusty toolbox into Mitchell Estate Developers, one of the most successful real estate firms in Seattle. But on that cold, rain-soaked Tuesday in November, none of that money mattered. None of that success mattered. I was just a broken old man standing in front of a polished mahogany casket, burying my only child. Bradley was 38 years old. He was my blood, my pride, the boy I raised to take over my legacy after my wife, Diane, passed away. I handed him the reins of the company so I could finally step back. I even bought him and his new wife, Stephanie, a $4 million mansion on Mercer Island as a wedding gift. I wanted them to have the perfect life, a life I had to scrape and bleed to build. And there was Stephanie standing right beside me at the edge of the grave. She was 32, a former public relations director who always knew exactly how to play the crowd. She wore a custom black designer dress, clutching a soaked tissue, playing the role of the devastated widow to absolute perfection. The rain beat down on our black umbrellas. The priest was reading the final prayer. Friends and business partners looked at us with deep pity. Stephanie reached out and linked her arm tightly through mine. She rested her head against my shoulder. The photographers from the local business journals snapped pictures of the touching family moment. A grieving daughter-in-law leaning on her heartbroken father-in-law for support. But she was not seeking comfort. As the cameras flashed, she tilted her head upward, her lips brushing against my ear. Her voice was barely a whisper, completely masked by the sound of the pouring rain, but the venom in her words cut through me sharper than any knife. Stop this pathetic crying, Gregory. Bradley is gone. You have exactly 15 days to pack your bags and get out of my house. I stopped breathing. The cemetery, the rain, the faces of the guests. Everything seemed to blur into the dark tunnel. I slowly turned my head to look at her. Her eyes were still red from her performance for the crowd, but the look behind them was pure, unadulterated ice. There was no sorrow. There was only calculation, only victory. My own son had not even been lowered into the earth yet. His body was still resting above the wet soil. And this woman, the woman he loved, the woman I had welcomed into my home and treated like my own daughter, was already staking her claim on the empire. I felt a sickening twist in my stomach. A normal man might have lost his temper. A normal father might have screamed, caused a scene, demanded answers right there in front of the priest and the crowd. But you do not build a $50 million company by letting your emotions dictate your moves. I learned a long time ago that when an enemy reveals their hand, you do not panic, you observe. I swallowed the lump in my throat. I did not pull my arm away. I simply stared at the polished wood of my son's casket and nodded slowly. I let her believe that her cruelty had broken whatever spirit I had left. I let her believe that I was just a tired, defeated old man who would quietly fade into the background. When the service ended, we rode back to the Mercer Island estate in the same black limousine. The silence in the car was suffocating. I looked out the window at the gray Seattle skyline, trying to process the nightmare my life had become. Bradley was supposed to bury me. I was never supposed to bury him. And now the woman sitting across from me was looking at her phone, scrolling through messages, completely detached from the reality that she had just buried her husband. When we finally walked through the grand double doors of the mansion, the house I had purchased with my own sweat and blood, she did not offer me a glass of water. She did not ask how I was holding up. She simply took off her black coat, tossed it onto a chair, and walked into the kitchen to pour herself a glass of expensive wine. I stood in the foyer, my wet shoes sinking into the luxury carpet. I needed to know why. I needed to understand how someone could be so heartless, so brazen, so quickly. I walked into the kitchen. She was leaning against the marble counter, sipping her wine, looking completely relaxed. "Stephanie," I said, my voice hoarse from crying. "What did you mean at the cemetery? Why are you doing this?" She set her glass down and let out a heavy, dramatic sigh. The coldness she showed at the grave instantly vanished, replaced by a flawless mask of the overwhelmed, tragic victim. "Gregory, please try to understand," she said, her voice shaking with fake emotion. "I did not want to do this today, but you forced my hand. Bradley left us in a terrible situation." I frowned, confused. "What are you talking about? Bradley was doing incredibly well. The company revenues are up." She shook her head, forcing a single tear to roll down her cheek. "That is what he wanted you to believe. But Bradley had a sickness, Gregory. A terrible addiction. He was gambling. High-stakes offshore accounts, illegal syndicates. He blew millions of dollars over the last year. He mortgaged this house to the brink of foreclosure. We owe dangerous people a lot of money. I have to sell this estate immediately just to keep us from being ruined. I need you to leave so I can stage the house and sell it before the bank takes it all." She looked at me with those wide, pleading eyes, playing the part of the desperate woman trying to clean up her dead husband's mess. It was a perfect story. A tragic, believable excuse to kick me out and liquidate the asset. But there was one massive flaw in her performance. I raised Bradley. I taught him the value of $1 from the moment he could walk. Bradley was the most meticulous, conservative man I knew. He tracked every expense on spreadsheets. He hated casinos. He hated unnecessary risk. The boy once agonized for 3 weeks over whether to buy a new car because he felt it was an irresponsible depreciation of an asset. Bradley did not gamble. He despised gambling. I looked at the woman standing in front of me, sipping her wine in the house I bought, telling me my son was a reckless degenerate. My gut screamed that she was lying. And if she was lying about the money, what else was she lying about? I did not argue. I just nodded slowly, letting my shoulders slump. "I understand, Stephanie. I will pack my things." She smiled a sad, pathetic little smile. "Thank you, Gregory. It is for the best." I turned and walked up the grand staircase to the guest room. I closed the door and locked it. I wiped the tears from my eyes. The grieving father was gone. The founder of Mitchell Estate Developers was back. She wanted to play a game of deception. But she had no idea she just picked a fight with a man who wrote the rulebook. I sat on the edge of the guest room bed, listening to the heavy rain lashing against the massive windows of the mansion. The silence in the house was heavy, suffocating, broken only by the distant, muffled sound of Stephanie moving around downstairs. She was likely pouring herself another glass of that expensive wine, celebrating her supposed victory. I closed my eyes and let the reality of the situation wash over me. My son was dead. The boy I had taught to ride a bicycle, the young man I had proudly watched, graduate the leader I had trusted with my life, work was gone. And his widow had just given me a strict eviction notice under the guise of a tragic financial disaster. Let us break down her magnificent lie. According to Stephanie, my son Bradley was a degenerate gambler. She painted a picture of a man spiraling out of control, secretly wiring millions of dollars to offshore accounts, losing everything we had built to illegal syndicates. She claimed the bank was breathing down her neck, threatening foreclosure on this very mansion, and that dangerous people were demanding their money. She needed me out so she could quickly stage the property, sell it, and vanish before the wolves arrived at the door. It was a story designed to evoke panic, pity, and immediate compliance from an old grieving father. But Stephanie made a fatal miscalculation. She misunderstood the fundamental core of the man I raised. Bradley was not just my son. He was my student. When he was 10 years old, I did not just give him an allowance. I made him balance a ledger. I taught him that every single dollar was a drop of sweat, a moment of time we could never get back. By the time he was in high school, he was analyzing market trends and understanding compound interest. He was the most meticulous, highly conservative man I had ever known. He loathed casinos. He despised the very concept of gambling, viewing it as an insult to hard work. I remembered a time just 5 years ago when we were negotiating a major commercial acquisition downtown. Bradley had agonized for weeks over a 2% variance in the projected profit margins. He ran the spreadsheets dozens of times, refusing to sign the deal until every variable was accounted for and every risk was mitigated. That was the man he was. He respected stability. He respected the empire I had transferred to him. The idea that this same man would suddenly develop a reckless, uncontrollable urge to throw millions of dollars into the dark void of offshore gambling was not just improbable. It was entirely impossible. Yet she had delivered her performance with such conviction. The trembling voice, the perfectly tear rolling down her cheek, the desperate pleading look in her eyes. It was a masterclass in manipulation. If I had been anyone else, a man who did not know his son deeply, I might have fallen for it. I might have packed my bags in a panic, offering her whatever savings I had left to help clear his fictitious debts. But I am definitely not a fool, and I am not completely blind. Her lie was the first crack in her perfect facade, a desperate attempt to cover up a much darker truth. If Bradley did not lose that money gambling, then where did it go? Why would she need to fabricate such a massive, urgent financial crisis? Why the sudden, desperate rush to liquidate a $4 million estate, just days after a funeral? People who are truly in danger, people who are genuinely grieving, do not act with such cold, calculated efficiency. They do not whisper eviction notices into the ears of heartbroken fathers while the cameras flash. They do not sip wine in the kitchen, completely unbothered, while supposedly owing millions to dangerous criminals. Her actions contradicted her words at every single turn. I stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the darkened driveway. I knew I had to play my part perfectly. I had to be the broken, compliant old man she expected me to be. If I challenged her now, if I accused her of lying, she would put her guard up. She would cover her tracks. I needed her to feel secure. I needed her to believe that her brilliant lie had worked flawlessly. Arrogance is the greatest vulnerability of a manipulator. When they think they have won, they become sloppy. They make mistakes. And I was going to be waiting, watching in the shadows, ready to catch every single one of them. I walked over to the small suitcase I had brought with me. I did not have many belongings here. I had moved in only a few months ago, hoping to spend my twilight years enjoying the company of my son and the family he was supposed to build. Now those dreams were reduced to ashes. I carefully folded my few shirts and placed them in the bag. I made sure to move slowly, letting my footsteps drag heavily across the floorboards so she could hear my supposed defeat. Let her hear the sound of the old man surrendering. Let her bask in the false security of her triumph. Tomorrow I leave this house. I would walk out the front door, head bowed, holding my small bag, playing the role of the tragic victim of terrible circumstances. I would even manage to force a final trembling apology just to sell the pathetic illusion completely to her. But the moment I stepped off this property, the grieving father would step aside. The founder, the fighter, the wolf who built an empire from dirt would take over. She wanted to steal my legacy, and she wanted to erase the honor of my son. I was going to systematically dismantle her entire world piece by piece, lie by lie, until absolutely nothing remained of her future. The morning sun barely pierced through the heavy Seattle clouds as I began the charade. I woke up early, purposefully leaving my hair uncombed and my shoulders slumped. I needed to look like a man who had completely given up. I dragged my feet walking downstairs to get coffee. Stephanie was already there, dressed in a sleek cashmere sweater, sipping a green smoothie. When she saw me, her posture shifted. She lowered her eyes and put on that mask of sympathetic tragedy she had perfected the day before. She asked how I slept, her tone dripping with fake concern. I told her I barely slept, that the weight of Bradley and his supposed debts was crushing me. I promised her I would have my things out by the end of the week so she could meet with real estate agents. She reached out and patted my arm, telling me how brave I was being and how much Bradley would have appreciated my understanding. The physical contact made my skin crawl, but I just nodded and thanked her. I took my coffee and shuffled back upstairs to the guest room, leaving the door open just a crack so I could listen. I pulled a few cardboard boxes from the closet and began tossing my books and clothes into them. Every movement was calculated. I wanted to make enough noise to prove I was actively packing, but keep enough silence to monitor her movements. About an hour passed. The quiet hum of the massive house was suddenly broken by the sharp, echoing sound of Stephanie laughing. It was not a polite chuckle or a nervous giggle. It was a deep, resonant laugh of genuine delight. I stopped folding a shirt and stood perfectly still. I walked softly toward the slightly open door and peered through the narrow gap into the grand hallway. Stephanie was pacing back and forth near the top of the sweeping staircase. She was holding her phone to her ear, her face completely animated, radiating joy. But it was not her laughter that caught my attention. It was what she was wearing around her neck. Resting against her dark sweater was a breathtaking, intricate diamond necklace. It caught the dull morning light and fractured it into a dozen brilliant sparkles. I recognized the craftsmanship instantly. When my wife Diane was still alive, I spent decades buying her fine jewelry for our anniversaries. I knew the high-end designers, the cuts, the settings. What Stephanie was wearing was a custom Cartier piece heavy with flawless stones. A necklace like that easily cost upwards of $80,000. Bradley did not buy that for her. I knew my son well, and I knew his finances. He would never purchase something so ostentatiously flashy, especially not if he was supposedly drowning in millions of dollars of offshore gambling debt. Men who are terrified of losing their homes to dangerous syndicates do not buy custom diamond necklaces for their wives. They sell them. I held my breath and pressed my ear closer to the gap in the door, focusing entirely on her side of the phone conversation. Her tone was light, flirty, and completely devoid of grief. "Yes, I am looking at the dates right now," she said, her voice echoing clearly in the vast hallway. No, we cannot fly commercial. Book the first-class suite for the flight. I want to leave by the end of the month. Make sure the villa in St. Bart's has the infinity pool we talked about, the one overlooking the private beach. Do not worry about the cost. Money is absolutely not an issue anymore. I felt a cold rush of adrenaline flood my veins. Money is absolutely not an issue anymore. Those were the words of a woman who had just buried her husband 24 hours ago. Those were the words of a woman who told me last night that she was terrified of the bank foreclosing on the mansion. People who owe millions to criminal gambling rings do not plan tropical luxury vacations to St. Bart's. They do not demand first-class flights and private villas with infinity pools. She laughed again at something the person on the other end of the line said. "I will call you back later," she whispered, her voice lowering into an intimate purr. "I need to make sure the old man is actually packing. He is moving slower than a snail, but he bought the entire story. Just a few more days and the house will be completely empty." She ended the call and hummed a cheerful little tune as she walked down the hall and disappeared into the master suite. I stepped back from the door, my chest rising and falling, with slow, measured breaths. The gut feeling I had in the kitchen last night had just crystallized into absolute, undeniable certainty. There was no gambling debt. There were no dangerous loan sharks coming to take the house. Bradley had not squandered the family fortune. Stephanie was lying about everything. She was flush with cash dripping in new diamonds and planning a luxury getaway with someone on the phone who she was clearly very intimate with. She had stolen the money. I did not know how yet, and I did not know who was helping her, but I knew she had drained the accounts. My son was dead, and his widow was celebrating. The grief that had been suffocating me for days evaporated, entirely replaced by a singular razor-sharp focus. I needed proof. I needed the paper trail. She could lie to me and she could lie to the guests at the funeral, but the numbers would never lie. I looked across the hall toward the closed double doors of Bradley's private home office. Stephanie thought I was just a broken old man packing his sweaters. She believed she had won. I waited for the shower to run, then I started the real hunt today. I stood in the quiet hallway, listening intently. The faint, steady sound of water running through the plumbing told me Stephanie was finally in the shower. I had perhaps 20 minutes. I moved swiftly down the corridor toward the heavy mahogany doors of Bradley's private home office. She had locked it, of course. But this was my house long before it was hers, and I knew every single flaw in its construction. I slipped a thin piece of rigid plastic from my wallet, slid it into the door jamb above the latch, and applied downward pressure. With a soft click, the lock gave way. I stepped inside and silently closed the door behind me. The room felt like a tomb. The air was stale, still holding the faint scent of my son's cedar cologne. The shelves were perfectly lined with his architectural models and leather-bound books. His massive oak desk sat in the center of the room, impeccably organized. Bradley never left a pen out of place. I walked over to the desk and opened his silver laptop. The screen flickered to life, displaying a standard setup screen. My heart sank. The hard drive had been completely wiped. It was restored to factory settings. A man running from dangerous gambling syndicates does not take the time to wipe his personal computer with military-grade erasure software before dying of a sudden heart attack. That takes hours of deliberate, calculated effort. Stephanie had scrubbed the machine to destroy the financial history. She thought she had erased the past, but she underestimated the lessons I imparted to my son. I began to search the physical space. I checked behind the framed photographs inside the binding of his favorite classic novels and beneath the heavy area rug. Nothing. I knelt down and opened the bottom drawer of the desk. It was empty. But I did not stand back up. I stayed on my knees and closed my eyes, picturing Bradley as a 12-year-old boy. He had always been terrified of losing his school projects or having his private journals read. I was obsessed with redundancy and hidden compartments. I remembered a rainy Sunday afternoon 30 years ago when I found him crying because a power surge had corrupted his computer. I sat him down and told him that a smart man never trusts a single point of failure. I taught him how to create physical backups and, more importantly, how to hide them where no ordinary thief would ever think to look. I reached my hand deep into the empty cavity where the bottom drawer usually rested. I pressed my fingers against the underside of the desk frame, feeling along the rough, unfinished wood. My fingertips brushed against something cold and metallic. It was held in place by a thick strip of heavy-duty industrial tape. A tight smile formed on my face. "You were always a good student, Bradley," I whispered into the empty room. I peeled the tape back slowly, careful not to make a sound. A small black external solid-state drive fell into the palm of my hand. I pulled a secure tablet from my bag, a device completely disconnected from the mansion's network. I plugged the black drive into the port. Instantly, a black screen popped up demanding an encryption password. It was a sophisticated security protocol, the kind that would lock permanently after 3 failed attempts. Stephanie must have found this drive, realized she could never guess the password, and decided to leave it hidden, assuming no one else would ever find it either. But I did not need to guess. When Bradley first opened his own bank account as a teenager, he asked me how to create a password that no hacker could ever break. I taught him a simple but unbreakable alphanumeric cipher. We took the name of his childhood, golden retriever, the year the dog was born, and shifted every letter forward by 3 spaces in the alphabet. It was a formula he adopted for everything truly important in his life, a secret language shared only between a father and his son. I stared at the blinking cursor on the screen. The dog's name was Barnaby. The year was 1994. I carefully translated the letters in my head, shifting each one forward, converting the familiar memory into a complex string of random characters. My hands were shaking slightly as I typed the final sequence into the tablet. I took a deep breath, praying that he had not abandoned our old tradition, and pressed the Enter key. The screen froze for a fraction of a second. Then the lock icon vanished, and the secure drive opened. Hundreds of neatly organized folders populated the bright screen. I scrolled past the personal photos and project drafts, going straight for a folder labeled simply with the current year. Inside, I found the raw, unedited financial statements for Mitchell Estate Developers and all his personal accounts. I opened the master ledger, my eyes scanning the endless columns of numbers. The reality hit me like a physical blow. The mortgage on the mansion was completely paid off. There were 0 liabilities. The company reserves were healthy. There was no trace of any gambling debts and no missing funds lost to shadowy offshore casinos. Bradley was in perfect financial standing. But as I scrolled further down the ledger, a glaring, terrifying anomaly caught my eye. There was a massive, systematic hemorrhage of liquid capital from the corporate expansion fund. It was not a chaotic loss caused by reckless bets. It was a highly structured, deliberate drain of resources. My son was not broke. He was being robbed blindly from the inside. Every single day, immense wealth simply vanished into thin air. The scale of this financial betrayal was absolutely staggering. Stephanie was orchestrating a quiet corporate massacre right beneath his trusting nose, and I was going to find out exactly where she was hiding every single penny. I sat back in Bradley's heavy leather chair, the glow of the tablet screen casting a cold light across my face in the darkened office. My heart hammered against my ribs, not with the erratic flutter of an old man, but with the steady, pulsing rhythm of a soldier, realizing he was standing in the middle of a minefield. The spreadsheet illuminated the full scale of the betrayal. I needed to understand the mechanics of this financial slaughter. I began filtering the outgoing wire transfers from the corporate reserve accounts. Mitchell Estate Developers had always maintained a massive liquidity pool to act quickly on commercial property acquisitions. It was a strategy I had implemented decades ago, and Bradley had maintained it flawlessly. Now that pool was bleeding out. I isolated the transfers dating back exactly 6 months. The first anomaly appeared in early May. A wire for $250,000. The memo line read as a consulting retainer for foreign market expansion. 2 weeks later, another wire for $400,000 followed, labeled as preliminary zoning assessments. The amounts kept increasing, growing bolder and more frequent. 800,000, 1.2 million, 2 million. Every single wire transfer was routed to the exact same external entity. The receiving account belonged to a corporation named Apex Zenith LLC. I had never heard of that company in my entire life. We did not use foreign consultants for local Seattle real estate, and we certainly did not pay them millions of dollars for vague preliminary assessments. I highlighted the columns, running a quick summation formula. The final number materialized at the bottom of the screen. $15 million. Exactly $15 million had been siphoned out of our family empire in just under 6 months. It was a surgical, precise extraction of wealth. I rubbed my tired eyes, trying to make sense of the authorization protocols. In our company, any wire transfer over $50,000 required dual signatures. Bradley was the chief executive officer, meaning his digital authorization was mandatory. The second signature had to come from a senior department head. I clicked on the digital footprint of the first major transaction to view the attached clearance forms. The primary signature was Bradley's, but a quick visual inspection told me everything I needed to know. The digital stamp was authentic, but the timestamps showed the approvals were executed in the middle of the night, often between 2 and 4 in the morning. Bradley was a creature of habit. He slept like a rock and never worked past 8 in the evening if he could help it. Someone had accessed his secure terminal while he was asleep. I looked down at the secondary signature on the wire authorization form. It belonged to the Director of Public Relations. It belonged to Stephanie. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with sickening clarity. When Bradley and Stephanie first got married, she begged him for a role in the company. She claimed she wanted to be part of the family legacy. I had advised Bradley against mixing marriage with business, but he loved her too much to deny her. He created the Public Relations Director position just for her. It was a high-level executive title with top-tier administrative access, including secondary financial authorization privileges for marketing budgets and corporate acquisitions. She had the security clearance, and she shared a bed with the man who held the primary keys. She waited until he was asleep, logged into his devices, authorized the massive transfers to Apex Zenith LLC, and then validated them herself using her own executive credentials. She bypassed every single internal protocol by playing both sides of the digital authentication process. It was brilliant, and it was entirely evil. The narrative she had spun for me downstairs was completely unraveling. She had stood in the weeping crocodile tears, claiming that Bradley was a gambling addict who had destroyed our lives. She painted him as a reckless fool to justify her urgent need to sell the mansion and evict me. But the truth was that my son had been working tirelessly to keep the company afloat while she drained the lifeblood right out of it. She did not just want me out of the house to stage it for a quick sale. She wanted me out because my presence was a threat. I was the only person left in the world who could look at the company books and instantly recognize the fraud. She needed me gone so she could liquidate the remaining physical assets, take the cash, and disappear to St. Bart's with her new diamond necklace and her stolen millions. I unplugged the black drive from the tablet and carefully tucked it into my inner jacket pocket. I felt a cold, hard knot of fury settling deep in my stomach. The woman sleeping down the hall was not just a greedy daughter-in-law. She was an absolute monster. She had systematically dismantled my son's legacy, stolen $15 million from the empire I built, and then had the audacity to smear his good name at his own funeral to cover her tracks. I slowly stood up from the desk, pushing the chair back into its exact original position. I made sure not a single pen or paper was out of place. I locked the tablet and placed it back into my bag. I walked to the door, listening once more. The house was dead quiet. The shower had stopped long ago. I slipped out of the office, re-engaged the lock with a soft click, and walked back toward the guest room. As I moved through the shadows of the mansion, I realized the stakes had fundamentally changed. This was no longer just about protecting my financial legacy or keeping my home. This was about vengeance. Stephanie had humiliated me. She had robbed my son blind, and now she was going to pay for every single sin. On the morning of the third day, I walked out of the Mercer Island mansion for the very last time. I did not say goodbye. I did not leave a note. I simply carried my single leather duffel bag down the grand sweeping staircase, past the expensive artwork I had purchased, and out through the heavy mahogany front doors. The Seattle air was biting and damp, perfectly matching the hollow chill settling deep within my chest. I left my luxury sedan parked in the sprawling garage and ordered a standard rideshare vehicle to pick me up at the end of the long driveway. I needed to disappear completely from Stephanie's immediate radar. She wanted me out of the picture, and I was going to give her exactly what she asked for, but on my own terms. I directed the driver to take me to a modest, nondescript motel situated on the outskirts of the city. It was the kind of place that charged by the week and asked absolutely no questions. The room smelled faintly of stale smoke and harsh cleaning chemicals. The wallpaper was peeling at the corners, and the mattress sagged in the middle. It was a far cry from the opulent luxury of the estate I had just abandoned, but to me it was perfect. It was a secure, untraceable command center. I locked the flimsy wooden door, pulled the thin curtains shut to block out the dreary streetlights, and sat down on the edge of the creaking bed. I pulled my secure tablet from my bag and connected it to a portable cellular hotspot I had purchased with cash on the way over. I could not risk using any device or network that Stephanie might be monitoring. I opened my encrypted contact list and dialed a number I had not used in nearly a decade. The phone rang 3 times before a gruff, gravelly voice answered on the other end. "I need a favor, Derek," I said quietly into the receiver. Derek Shaw was not a corporate lawyer or a polished accountant. He was an independent private investigator who operated almost exclusively in the gray, murky waters of the legal system. We crossed paths 20 years ago when a rival developer tried to sabotage one of my commercial building sites. Derek was the man who found the proof I needed to destroy that competitor. He was ruthless, highly efficient, and fiercely loyal to the people who paid him well. Gregory Mitchell. Derek replied, a hint of surprise softening his rough tone. "I heard about your boy. I am truly sorry for your loss. Bradley was a good man. He was the best of us," I said, my voice tightening. "But that is exactly why I am calling you. I need you to go to work for me right now, and I need it completely off the books. No official invoices, no digital trails tying back to my primary accounts. Tell me what you need," he said, his tone instantly shifting from sympathetic to strictly professional. "I need you to tear apart a corporate entity," I explained. "It is a shell company called Apex Zenith LLC. $15 million of my company money was illegally wired into their accounts over the past 6 months. I need to know exactly who registered it, where it is based, and who is pulling the strings." "Give me 24 hours, Derek said before ending the call. I spent the next day pacing the small confines of the motel room. The isolation was maddening, but it gave me time to think, to process the magnitude of the betrayal. Stephanie had stolen millions, completely bypassed our security protocols, and successfully evicted me from my own property. She was currently playing the grieving widow while sitting on a stolen fortune. But the money was only the symptom of the disease. I needed to find the source. Late the following afternoon, a heavy knock echoed against my motel room door. 2 sharp taps followed by a pause, then a third. It was the knock we had agreed upon. I unbolted the lock and let Derek inside. He was a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s, wearing a faded trench coat and carrying a thick manila folder. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He walked straight to the small circular table in the corner of the room, dropped the folder, and pulled out a chair. "You were right, Gregory," he said, opening the folder to reveal a stack of printed financial routing documents. "Apex Zenith LLC is a ghost. It does not exist in any physical capacity. There is no office, no staff, and no legitimate business operations. It is a classic offshore washing machine." "Where is it registered?" I asked, leaning over his shoulder to look at the paperwork. "The Bahamas," Derek replied, pointing a thick finger at a highlighted line of text. "It was incorporated 7 months ago, right before the wire transfers from your company started. The registration was handled through a boutique corporate law firm in Nassau that specializes in hiding beneficiary ownership. They use proxy directors to shield the real people in charge." I stared at the documents, frustration boiling up inside me. "So we have nothing. Just a dead end in the Caribbean." "I did not say that," Derek smirked, pulling a secondary document from the back of the folder. "Proxy directors are good, but they are not perfect. The law firm required a primary managing contact for the initial banking setup. The person who physically controls the routing numbers. They tried to bury the name under 3 layers of digital shell companies, but I managed to trace the digital signature back to a localized internet protocol address right here in Seattle." "Who is it?" I demanded. Derek flipped the page, revealing a printed photograph of a man in his 30s. The managing director of Apex Zenith LLC is Carter Jenkins, Derek stated. Who is Carter Jenkins? Derek sighed heavily, leaning back in the flimsy motel chair. Carter Jenkins is not a banker, Gregory. He is not a corporate consultant. Derek tossed another glossy photograph onto the table, this one showing Jenkins standing in front of a sleek wellness clinic downtown. He calls himself a holistic pharmacist. He runs a private practice catering to Seattle elites, specializing in customized vitamin infusions, exotic supplements, and alternative medicine. I stared at the picture of the man. He was young, athletic, with a meticulously groomed beard and an arrogant smirk. Why would a glorified vitamin salesman be the managing director of a Bahamian shell company, holding $15 million of my money? I asked, though a sickening feeling was already taking root in the pit of my stomach. Derek did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his manila folder and pulled out a thick stack of surveillance photographs. He spread them out across the table like a dealer dealing a hand of cards. Because he is not just managing the money, Derek said quietly. He is managing your daughter-in-law. I looked down at the photographs. The first image showed Stephanie and Carter sitting together at a secluded table in a high-end restaurant, their hands intertwined over the white tablecloth. The second photo showed them walking out of a luxury hotel downtown, Carter wrapping his arm tightly around her waist. The third was a clear, undeniable shot of them kissing passionately in the driver's seat of her car. My chest tightened as a wave of absolute disgust washed over me. When were these taken? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I pulled these from a private investigator who was tailing Jenkins for a separate divorce case a few months ago, Derek explained. The timestamps on these photos aligned perfectly with the dates Bradley was out of town, overseeing the commercial builds in Portland and Denver. Every time your son left the state to work for the company, Stephanie was in the city spending her afternoons and evenings with Carter Jenkins. I closed my eyes, picturing Bradley. My son had worked himself to the bone, flying up and down the coast, trying to expand the empire. He thought he was building for his family. He trusted her implicitly. He gave her the keys to his home and his life work. And while he was sitting in lonely hotel rooms reviewing blueprints, the woman he loved was sleeping with a fraudulent pharmacist and draining his corporate accounts. They have been planning this for a long time. Derek continued tapping the offshore registration documents. They set up Apex Zenith as the ultimate retirement fund. They used her security clearance to funnel the money out in increments that would not trigger immediate federal banking flags. The plan was to steal enough to live like royalty, liquidate whatever physical assets they could get their hands on, and disappear to the Caribbean before the annual audit caught the discrepancies. I opened my eyes and looked at the photos again. The diamond necklace she was wearing in the hallway yesterday suddenly made perfect sense. It was a gift from her lover bought with stolen money, a glittering trophy of their successful heist. She was booking that first-class ticket and the private villa in St. Bart's for the two of them. Bradley was nothing but a temporary obstacle in their grand, twisted romance. But as the initial shock subsided, my mind, trained by decades of analyzing business logistics, began to catch on a glaring logical inconsistency. Something about the timeline was deeply wrong. I stared at the ceiling of the dingy motel room, piecing the variables together. Derek, I said, slowly turning my gaze back to the investigator. If the goal was simply to steal the $15 million and run away to an island, they had already succeeded. The money was securely parked in the Bahamas. Stephanie had her passport. She could have filed for divorce, taken half of Bradley's personal assets, and walked away a very rich woman. Derek frowned, crossing his arms over his broad chest. Greed makes people do irrational things, Gregory. Maybe she did not want to settle for half. Maybe she wanted the entire estate. No, I countered, standing up from the bed and beginning to pace the short length of the room. Bradley's personal net worth was a fraction of the corporate reserves. The big money, the $15 million, was already gone. They had won. There was absolutely no financial reason to stay in that house a single day longer than necessary. I stopped pacing and looked down at the photograph of Carter Jenkins, the holistic pharmacist with access to unregulated chemicals and exotic medical supplies. A cold, terrifying realization began to form in the back of my mind. Bradley was 38, I whispered. He ran triathlons and ate perfectly. His physical examination 3 months ago proved he had the heart of an athlete. Derek widened his eyes. Gregory, the coroner report was definitive. It was ruled a massive myocardial infarction, a sudden heart attack. It happens, I agreed, my voice dropping to a dangerous frequency. But it does not happen right after $15 million vanishes into an offshore account controlled by a pharmacist sleeping with the victim wife. If she was stealing, she would run. People pulling a heist do not stick around playing the grieving widow. Bradley did not die of a heart attack. I am going to prove she murdered him. Derek exhaled a long, heavy breath, rubbing the back of his neck with a calloused hand. If you are right about this, Gregory, we are dealing with a cold-blooded killer. A woman who will not hesitate to silence anyone who gets in her way. You are putting yourself in the direct line of fire by digging into this. I looked at the surveillance photographs scattered across the flimsy motel table, memorizing the arrogant smile on Carter Jenkins' face and the treacherous joy radiating from Stephanie. The grief that had been paralyzing me since the funeral was entirely gone. It had burned away, leaving behind a profound, terrifying clarity. I am not in the line of fire, Derek, I said, packing the photographs back into the manila folder. I am the one holding the match, and I am going to burn her entire world straight to the ground. I plugged the black external drive back into the secure tablet. The harsh white light of the screen illuminated the dusty walls of my motel room. I had just discovered that Stephanie and her lover, Carter Jenkins, had systematically drained $15 million from my company. But finding the stolen money was no longer my primary objective. I needed to find out what Bradley knew before he died. He was the chief executive officer. A hemorrhage of that magnitude could not have gone completely unnoticed, no matter how clever Stephanie thought she was with her midnight authorizations. My son was meticulous, and if he had caught on to the fraud, it would perfectly explain why a healthy 38-year-old man would suddenly and inexplicably suffer a fatal heart attack. I began digging deeper into the encrypted drive, bypassing the financial ledgers and moving into the personal storage sectors. Bradley was an architect of information. He categorized his digital life with the same precision he applied to his commercial real estate blueprints. I scrolled past years of tax documents, legal contracts, and property deeds. Near the bottom of the directory, hidden within a subfolder labeled under a defunct project name, I found a secondary highly encrypted vault. It required a different password. I tried the old childhood cipher again. It failed. I tried his mother's maiden name. It failed. I leaned back, closing my eyes, trying to think like my son. He was terrified of losing data, but he also loved patterns. I typed in the latitude and longitude coordinates of his childhood home, a sequence of numbers he once told me he used to ground himself when he felt overwhelmed. The screen unlocked. Inside the vault was a single folder created just 3 days before his death. The contents of that folder made my blood run absolutely cold. The first document was a draft of a formal criminal complaint, addressed to the local field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Bradley had meticulously outlined the entire embezzlement scheme. He had identified the shell company Apex Zenith LLC. He had flagged the IP addresses used to bypass the dual authorization protocols. He had even documented the exact times Stephanie had logged into his secure terminal while he was asleep. He had compiled a bulletproof, irrefutable case against his own wife. The second document was a set of fully drafted, unsigned divorce papers citing irreconcilable differences and profound financial fraud. My hands were shaking as I clicked on the final file in the folder. It was an audio recording. I hesitated before pressing play. I had not heard my son's voice since the brief voicemail he left me 2 days before he died. I took a slow, deep breath, bracing myself for the sound of his voice, and tapped the screen. The recording was jagged, the audio slightly muffled, as if the phone had been placed hastily inside a jacket pocket. But the voices were unmistakable. "You think I am an idiot," Stephanie Bradley's voice echoed through the small motel room. He sounded furious, his tone vibrating with a tightly coiled rage I had rarely heard from him. "You think I would not notice $15 million missing from the expansion reserves? You used my credentials. You logged into my terminal." Stephanie's voice responded, sounding surprisingly calm, almost dismissive. "Bradley, you are overreacting. The money is safe. It is an investment strategy. I was going to tell you about it after the audit." "Do not lie to me!" Bradley shouted, the sound of a fist slamming against a hard surface reverberating through the audio. "I tracked the wire transfers. I found the registration for Apex Zenith in the Bahamas. I know exactly what you are doing. You are stealing from my father's company. You are stealing from me." There was a long, heavy silence on the recording. When Stephanie finally spoke again, the mask of the innocent wife was entirely gone. Her voice was cold, flat, and devoid of any emotion. "So what are you going to do about it, Bradley? Are you going to run to your daddy and tell him you let your wife rob him blind? He will never look at you the same way again. You will be a failure in his eyes." "I am not going to my father," Bradley replied, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I am going to the FBI. I have drafted the complaint. I have the digital logs. I know about the offshore accounts. I am filing the divorce papers tomorrow, and on Monday morning I am handing the entire drive over to the federal authorities. You are going to federal prison, Stephanie." Another silence stretched across the recording. It felt thick and suffocating. "You are making a massive mistake, Bradley," Stephanie said softly. "A mistake you will not be able to fix." "I am fixing it right now," Bradley shot back. "Get out of my office. Get out of this house." The recording ended with the sharp sound of a door slamming shut. I sat in the dim light of the motel room, staring blankly at the dark screen of the tablet. The timeline was now perfectly, horrifyingly clear. Bradley had confronted her on a Friday night. He had told her he was going to the FBI on Monday morning. He had laid out all of his evidence and threatened her with federal prison. And on Sunday night, less than 48 hours later, my healthy, athletic 38-year-old son suffered a sudden, massive, and entirely fatal heart attack. Stephanie did not just steal from our family. She did not just evict me from my home. She had looked my son in the eye, realized he was going to destroy her perfect plan, and she had permanently silenced him. She murdered my boy to protect her stolen $15 million, and then she had the sheer audacity to stand by his grave and tell me to pack my bags. The rage that ignited inside me was no longer a hot, chaotic fire. It was absolute freezing, absolute zero. I was going to make sure she lost everything, including her freedom. The pale morning light crept through the cheap motel blinds, illuminating the dust dancing in the air. I had not slept a single second. I sat frozen in that hard wooden chair, the echoes of my son making his final fatal stand replaying in my mind on an endless loop. Bradley had cornered her. He had handed her a one-way ticket to federal prison, and less than 2 days later, he was dead. The official death certificate signed and stamped by the county medical examiner listed the cause of death as a massive myocardial infarction, a sudden catastrophic heart attack. When I first heard that diagnosis in the chaotic hours after his passing, I was too blinded by sudden grief to question the medical terminology. But now, sitting in the cold reality of the motel room, the absurdity of that medical conclusion struck me with the force of a physical blow. Bradley was 38 years old. He was not just healthy. He was a machine. My son competed in regional triathlons. He ran half marathons to burn off corporate stress. His resting heart rate was a point of pride monitored daily on his expensive fitness watches. He ate a strict diet, drank in moderation, and underwent comprehensive executive health screenings every 6 months to satisfy the life insurance policies tied to our real estate empire. The cardiologists had always given him a completely pristine bill of health. A man with the cardiovascular system of an elite marathon runner does not simply drop dead in his own living room from a natural heart block. It was a biological impossibility. The pieces of the aftermath began to align in a sickeningly perfect sequence. I remembered how aggressively Stephanie had behaved at the hospital, while I was collapsing under the weight of losing my only child. She was already directing the medical staff with military efficiency. She had refused to request a comprehensive private autopsy, accepting the preliminary ruling of the overworked county coroner without a single question. But the most damning detail was what came next. Stephanie had immediately arranged for a closed casket memorial service and scheduled a direct cremation to take place just 48 hours after the funeral. I had begged her. I had pleaded for a traditional burial, a place where I could visit my boy, a plot next to his mother, in the family estate. Stephanie had looked at me with those cold, calculating eyes and claimed that Bradley had explicitly told her he wanted to be cremated. She said a prolonged viewing would simply be too traumatic for her fragile emotional state. I had backed down, wanting to respect what I thought were her genuine wishes as a grieving wife. Now the dark, horrifying truth behind her rush to the incinerator was glaringly obvious. Fire consumes everything. A cremation would turn my son into ash, and along with his bones, it would incinerate the only physical evidence of his murder. She was not trying to spare herself emotional trauma. She was trying to destroy a crime scene. I grabbed my phone and dialed Tom Becker. Tom was not a criminal defense lawyer. He was my lead corporate attorney, a ruthless, brilliant man who had helped me navigate multi-million-dollar hostile takeovers for over 30 years. He picked up on the second ring. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him to drop whatever contract he was reviewing, clear his schedule for the next 24 hours, and listen to me very carefully. I laid out the timeline. I explained the missing $15 million, the shell company in the Bahamas, the holistic pharmacist lover, and the audio recording on the encrypted drive. Then I told him my Bradley had been poisoned and that Stephanie was using the impending cremation to permanently erase the forensic evidence. The silence on the line was thick and heavy. When Tom finally spoke, his voice lacked its usual polished corporate warmth. It was sharp, focused, and entirely lethal. He asked me exactly what time the cremation was scheduled to take place. I checked the itinerary Stephanie had distributed to the family. It was scheduled for 2:00 this afternoon at the downtown crematorium. I looked at the digital clock on the motel nightstand. It was currently 8:15 in the morning. We had less than 6 hours to stop the furnace from turning the murder weapon into smoke. Tom immediately began outlining the legal strategy. As the surviving spouse, Stephanie held the primary legal right to dictate the disposition of Bradley's remains. But Washington state law contained specific provisions regarding suspicious circumstances and the rights of blood relatives. If we could present sufficient preliminary evidence of foul play, a judge could issue an emergency ex parte injunction to immediately halt the cremation pending a comprehensive independent autopsy. I authorized Tom to use whatever resources were necessary. I did not care if he had to wake up a superior court judge at home or bribe a clerk to expedite the filing. He promised to draft the emergency petition citing profound financial irregularities and the highly questionable timeline of the myocardial infarction in a patient with a documented history of flawless cardiovascular health. I paced the motel room for the next 3 hours. Every passing minute felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I stared at the clock as the numbers ticked closer to the afternoon deadline. Finally, my phone illuminated with a text message from Tom. He had successfully secured the judge's signature. A court courier was currently speeding across the city to serve the binding injunction directly to the director of the crematorium. I sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, burying my face in my hands. The cremation was halted. Stephanie had failed to burn the evidence. My son was safe in the cold storage of the morgue, waiting to tell me exactly how he died. I drove straight to the county medical examiner office. The building was a brutalist block of gray concrete. I parked my car in the empty lot and stepped out into the biting wind. I began to pace the asphalt, the crunch of my shoes offering a distraction from the hurricane of thoughts. Stephanie was undoubtedly receiving the legal notice right now. I could picture her standing in the crematorium lobby, her mask of grief slipping to reveal panic. She would immediately call her expensive defense attorneys. By Monday morning, she would have a fleet of corporate lawyers filing motions to overturn the injunction, citing her authority as the surviving spouse. The court system was slow and easily manipulated. If her lawyers succeeded in lifting the order, Bradley would be incinerated before I could legally compel the county to perform a secondary autopsy. I needed physical evidence right now, before the red tape could completely suffocate the truth. A battered black sedan pulled into the lot and parked diagonally. Derek Shaw stepped out, his heavy boots hitting the pavement. He walked over, handing me a steaming cup of black coffee. I briefed him on the injunction Tom had secured, explaining the narrow window of opportunity. Derek listened intently, taking a sip of his coffee. He agreed with my assessment. Stephanie would weaponize the courts, and standard procedure would keep us locked out of the morgue for weeks. But Derek did not operate within standard procedures. He told me he had cultivated a specific contact inside this county morgue over the years. It was a laboratory technician who occasionally supplemented his government salary by providing discreet logistical favors for private investigators. Derek explained that during a standard preliminary autopsy, the medical examiner always retains a small assortment of biological samples, blood and tissue, placing them in refrigerated storage for a short period before disposal. If we moved quickly, Derek could convince his contact to quietly release one of those retained blood samples directly into our custody for independent toxicological testing. I pulled a thick envelope of cash from my pocket, the emergency funds I had withdrawn days ago, and handed it to Derek. I told him to pay whatever exorbitant price was necessary to secure my son's blood. Derek nodded, tucking the envelope away, and walked briskly toward the rear entrance of the medical facility. I was left alone in the desolate parking lot. The wind picked up, cutting through my thin coat. I looked up at the row of frosted glass windows on the second floor. Somewhere behind that glass, my son was lying on a steel table. I thought about the sheer fragility of human life. Bradley had survived grueling triathlons, conquered massive corporate negotiations, and built a legacy of honor. He had been strong, vibrant, and incredibly careful. Yet all of that vitality had been effortlessly erased by a woman he trusted enough to share his home. Greed is a terrifying, insidious disease. It rots the human soul, turning an affectionate partner into a ruthless predator. Stephanie wanted absolute, unchallenged dominion over my empire, and she was willing to extinguish a beautiful life to achieve it. As I continued to pace the cracked asphalt, a profound psychological shift occurred deep within my core. Up until this very moment, I had been operating under the mindset of a betrayed businessman. I was a founder trying to protect his corporate assets from an embezzling thief. But as I stared at the cold concrete walls holding the remains of my only child, the corporate world ceased to matter. The $15 million stolen from the expansion fund felt utterly irrelevant. The mansions, the stock portfolios, the profit margins. They were all meaningless dust. I was no longer fighting an ungrateful daughter-in-law over a real estate fortune. I was hunting my son's killer. Every ounce of business acumen, every strategic instinct I had honed over 40 years in the ruthless corporate sector was now entirely repurposed for a singular, lethal objective. I was going to systematically dismantle the woman who murdered my boy. I was going to find the chemical weapon she used, trace it back to her holistic pharmacist lover, and lock them both in a federal cage for the rest of their natural lives. Nearly 40 minutes passed before the heavy metal door at the rear of the facility finally creaked open. Derek emerged from the shadows of the loading dock, carrying a small, hard plastic medical cooler tightly under his left arm. He walked toward me, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. He placed the cooler gently on the hood of my rental car and popped the latches. Nestled securely inside a thick layer of dry ice were two sealed glass vials containing dark crimson fluid. The name Bradley Mitchell was clearly printed on the sterile white labels. Derek looked me in the eye and confirmed the transaction was a complete success. The technician had logged the vials as damaged and disposed of, completely wiping them from the official county inventory records. We now possessed the definitive biological evidence required to bypass the bureaucratic gridlock. I closed the cooler carefully and firmly secured the heavy metal latches, feeling the immense weight of the dark truth resting right beneath my trembling fingertips. I instructed Derek to transport the samples immediately to a highly classified independent toxicology laboratory located just outside the city limits. We were now going to immediately run a complete and full-spectrum chemical analysis, hunting for any synthetic compound that could artificially trigger a catastrophic myocardial infarction. As Derek drove away into the distance, carrying the very last remaining physical piece of my son, I looked up slowly at the darkening Seattle sky. Stephanie believed she had successfully buried her secrets in the grave. But the blood she had stopped from flowing was about to speak very loudly. The truth would soon echo through every single courtroom in this entire city, ensuring her absolute destruction. The following 48 hours were the longest of my entire life. I remained confined within the faded walls of my dingy motel room, waiting for the independent toxicology laboratory to complete their comprehensive analysis of my son and his blood. Every time the heavy traffic rumbled past my window on the wet Seattle asphalt, my heart seized with a mixture of profound anticipation and agonizing dread. Derek had assured me that the lab director was a man of absolute discretion, a former military forensic pathologist who understood the grave urgency of our situation. But the agonizing slowness of the scientific process offered no comfort to a grieving father. I paced the short length of the floorboards until my knees ached, drinking endless cups of bitter black coffee, staring at the muted television screen, without comprehending a single image. Stephanie was currently living in my mansion, trying to finalize the legal paperwork to claim her stolen millions and permanently secure her total victory over our family. She was likely sleeping peacefully, completely unaware that a small plastic cooler holding the ultimate truth was sitting on a sterile metal laboratory bench just a few miles away. On Thursday evening, just as the heavy rain began to assault the windows once again, my cellular phone finally vibrated across the cheap wooden nightstand. I snatched it up instantly. It was Derek. His voice was grim, stripped of all the usual rough confidence he projected. He told me to sit down. I ignored his advice and stood perfectly still in the center of the room, bracing myself for the impact of his words. He explained that the chief toxicologist had run the blood samples through a highly specialized mass spectrometry screening, searching for anomalies that a standard county autopsy would simply ignore. What they found was a nightmare materialized into cold, hard data. Bradley did not suffer a natural myocardial infarction. His heart was perfectly healthy until the very second it was artificially forced to stop beating. Derek read directly from the preliminary laboratory report. The chemical analysis had detected lethal, unmistakable traces of a synthetic potassium-based compound deeply embedded within the tissue plasma. It was an incredibly rare, highly regulated paralytic agent often used in specialized surgical environments to induce rapid muscle relaxation. When administered in a concentrated lethal dosage outside of a controlled medical setting, it causes immediate and catastrophic cardiovascular collapse. It perfectly mimics the precise physiological symptoms of a sudden massive heart attack. It leaves the victim completely unable to breathe or speak within seconds, paralyzing the respiratory system while they remain fully conscious of their own impending death. The sheer cruelty of that chemical mechanism struck me with a physical force, knocking the breath completely out of my lungs. My son had not simply passed away in his sleep. He had been murdered in cold blood, suffocated and paralyzed in his own home, likely looking up into the eyes of the woman he loved as she watched the life fade from his body. The compound was nearly impossible to acquire on the open market. It was strictly controlled by federal medical boards and required high-level pharmaceutical licensing to even order a single vial. The toxicologist had explicitly noted that this was not a street drug or a common household poison. It was a sophisticated surgical weapon of murder. A weapon exclusively accessible to someone deeply embedded within the medical or pharmaceutical supply chain. The missing piece of the terrifying puzzle locked perfectly into place. Carter Jenkins, the holistic pharmacist, the man who managed the offshore shell company in the Bahamas, the man who had been secretly sleeping with my daughter-in-law while my son was away building a future for his family. Carter had the professional credentials, the chemical access, and the motive to supply the lethal dose. Stephanie had the proximity, the opportunity, and the 15 million reasons to administer it. I sank heavily onto the edge of the sagging motel mattress, clutching the phone tightly against my ear. Derek remained silent on the other end of the line, allowing me to process the staggering magnitude of the revelation. This was premeditated, calculated first-degree murder. Bradley had confronted Stephanie with the evidence of her massive financial embezzlement. He had drafted the criminal complaint for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He had packed his bags to leave her. He had given her an ultimatum. Instead of facing the legal consequences of her corporate theft, she contacted her lover, procured an untraceable chemical weapon, and executed my son to silence him forever. She killed him to protect her freedom, to claim the remaining real estate portfolio, and to secure the stolen offshore fortune. A deep, unnatural calm washed over me. The chaotic, blinding grief that had consumed me since the funeral was instantly incinerated by a singular, freezing focus. The tears I had shed at the cemetery felt like they belonged to a different man from a different lifetime. I thanked Derek for his work and told him to secure the physical copies of the toxicology report in his most fortified safe. I instructed him to maintain absolute silence and to prepare his team for an aggressive legal offensive. I ended the call and sat alone in the dark room, listening to the relentless Seattle rain. Stephanie had played a flawless game. She had deceived her husband, robbed my company, fooled. The county coroner manipulated the funeral guests and confidently evicted me from my own property. She believed she was holding every single winning card. But she had no idea that I was now holding the execution warrant for her entire life. She was going to pay. Not just with her stolen money, but with her freedom, her reputation, and her future. I was going to let her climb to the very pinnacle of her false victory, and then I was going to tear the ground out from beneath her feet and watch her empire fall. The morning sun cast a cold light over the city streets. I drove to the law firm feeling a deep sense of purpose. Tom Becker waited in his corner office with a thick stack of legal documents spread across his large wooden desk. He looked up as I entered and firmly closed the heavy door behind me. The silence in the room was absolute. We had a tremendous amount of work to do today. Stephanie thought she had outsmarted everyone, but she was about to learn a very painful lesson. I sat down and prepared to dismantle her life. Tom removed his glasses and pointed directly at the top sheet of paper. He informed me that Stephanie had moved quickly this morning. Her attorneys formally filed the preliminary petitions to inherit the 70% controlling interest of Mitchell Estate Developers. She confidently asserted her legal status as the sole surviving heir. She completely omitted any mention of my remaining foundational equity. She also submitted an urgent motion to act as the interim chief executive officer. She believed that securing this legal foothold made her the undisputed majority shareholder of a massive real estate empire. Her hubris was truly blinding. I walked over to the desk and scanned the aggressive legal jargon printed on the page. Tom explained that by claiming the 70% share, she immediately triggered a massive tax liability with the federal government. The assessed value of the corporate shares far exceeded the standard exemption thresholds. She was legally required to submit a payment of several $1 million to the government within a strict deadline. I asked Tom where a supposedly grieving widow would suddenly acquire those funds. He smiled grimly. We both knew she would be forced to repatriate the stolen money from the offshore account. I looked at my attorney and gave him a clear order. Do not block her filing under any circumstances. Tom blinked in surprise, instinctively wanting to file an immediate injunction to freeze her hostile corporate takeover. I shook my head and laid out the true depth of my strategy. I told him to let her sign every single federal tax form. Let her claim the entire estate under oath. Let her transfer the stolen money from the Bahamas to pay the government. Every single signature she places on those documents will constitute an independent count of severe federal wire fraud. If we stop her right now, she remains a murderer, hiding behind circumstantial financial anomalies. But if we let her proceed without interruption, she will voluntarily hand the authorities an irrefutable paper trail. That trail will link the embezzled corporate funds directly to her personal tax filings. We were not going to fight her for the company today. We were going to let her steal it willingly. In doing so, she would build her own federal prison cell. Tom grasped the sheer lethality of the maneuver. His eyes widened as he quickly pulled out a fresh blank yellow legal pad. We shifted our focus to the foundational incorporation documents. I instructed Tom to retrieve the original and sealed dossiers from his secure vault. He spread the aged parchment across the table and highlighted the specific legal framework I had constructed decades ago. When I handed the reins of the empire to my son, the transfer was never a simple, unconditional gift. I had explicitly instructed Tom to structure the handover utilizing a highly restrictive legal mechanism. It contained a deeply buried reversionary clause designed to completely protect the family legacy from any hostile external acquisitions or malicious corporate takeover attempts. Stephanie and her high-priced lawyers had clearly only reviewed the surface operating agreements. They completely missed the foundational trust architecture that governed the actual equity. I leaned over the desk and traced my finger along the faded ink of the reversionary clause. I told Tom that I would coordinate directly with Derek Shaw to monitor the exact moment Carter Jenkins authorized the wire transfer from the Bahamas. Once that stolen money touched American soil to pay the taxes, the trap would snap shut permanently. Tom assured me he would secretly prepare the necessary emergency injunctions for the upcoming battle. We would coordinate with his contacts at the Department of Justice. We needed to keep the criminal investigation entirely insulated from the civil probate proceedings until the optimal moment. I planned to maintain absolute radio silence for the next few days. I would continue to play the role of the defeated old man hiding in a cheap motel. I would offer absolutely zero resistance to her hostile corporate takeover. Let her bask in the false glory of her unchecked power. Let her believe that she had completely eradicated the Mitchell family legacy. She was entirely blind to her impending doom. Tom handed me a secure cellular phone to use for our future communications. It was heavily encrypted and completely untraceable by any commercial software. I placed the black device into my jacket pocket and thanked him for his unwavering loyalty. He simply nodded and stated that Bradley was like a nephew to him. We both shared a quiet moment of profound grief, acknowledging the brilliant young man whose life had been violently extinguished. But the sorrow quickly evaporated, replaced once again by that cold, calculating fury. We were the architects of retribution, and our blueprint was now flawlessly constructed today. I walked out of the towering glass skyscraper and merged into the bustling downtown pedestrian traffic. The chilly afternoon wind whipped against my face, but I barely registered the freezing temperature. My mind was completely consumed by the upcoming board meeting. Stephanie was undoubtedly preparing to summon the corporate directors to officially announce her absolute dominion over my company. She would expect me to attend via video conference playing the broken old man. I would give her exactly the pathetic performance she desired. Let the venomous spider weave her magnificent web. I was the fire that would burn it down. A sharp, aggressive knock shattered the quiet atmosphere of my dingy motel room early Thursday morning. I opened the flimsy wooden door to find a uniformed legal courier standing on the exterior walkway. He shoved a thick, heavily sealed envelope into my hands, demanded a quick signature on his digital pad, and briskly walked away without uttering a single syllable. The return address printed on the upper left corner belonged to the downtown corporate headquarters of Mitchell Estate Developers. I tore through the thick paper, pulling out a stack of aggressive legal demands printed on our own premium company letterhead. The primary document was a formal corporate eviction notice. It explicitly barred me from stepping foot inside the building I had purchased and renovated decades ago. Security personnel were instructed to physically escort me off the premises if I attempted to enter the glass lobby. Beneath that insulting mandate was a mandatory summons for an emergency board of directors meeting scheduled to commence in exactly 2 hours. Since I was legally prohibited from attending in person, a secure video conference link was provided at the bottom of the page. Stephanie was rapidly accelerating her malicious timeline to completely erase me. I immediately began preparing for the digital confrontation. The goal was to project total vulnerability and absolute defeat. I purposely wore a faded, slightly wrinkled dress shirt that hung loosely around my shoulders, emphasizing the weight I had lost since the funeral. I adjusted the motel desk lamp to cast harsh, unforgiving shadows across my face, highlighting every deep wrinkle and hollow contour. I positioned the camera angle slightly lower than eye level, creating a subtle psychological effect of submission. When I clicked the secure link to join the virtual boardroom, I was the perfect picture of a broken man. The screen flickered to life, displaying the expansive, polished mahogany table of the executive suite. Stephanie sat comfortably at the absolute head of the table, occupying the tall leather chair that had belonged to me for 40 years. She wore a tailored crimson designer suit, radiating aggressive confidence and absolute authority. Her custom diamond necklace sparkled brilliantly under the recessed ceiling lights. 6 of my senior board members sat stiffly along the sides of the massive table, their faces pale and their postures uncomfortably rigid. None of them dared to make direct eye contact with the camera lens observing them. Stephanie officially called the session to order with a sharp, echoing tap of a silver pen against the wood. She did not offer any traditional opening pleasantries or moments of silence for her recently deceased husband. Instead, she immediately projected a comprehensive financial slide onto the main presentation screen. The title of the document read, Asset Liquidation and Corporate Restructuring. She confidently announced that the company was pivoting away from long-term commercial development. Her voice echoed with practiced corporate jargon, entirely devoid of genuine business acumen, masking a ruthless scheme to gut the entire empire for fast, hard cash. Her primary proposal outlined the immediate sale of our 3 most valuable downtown commercial properties. She had secretly negotiated a preliminary buyout agreement with Vanguard Holdings, our fiercest and most aggressive local competitor. Vanguard was offering a staggering 30% discount below the current market valuation in exchange for an expedited fast cash closing within 14 days. It was an absolute massacre of generational wealth. She was deliberately sacrificing decades of carefully cultivated real estate equity just to quickly convert the physical brick-and-mortar assets into untraceable liquid capital before anyone could properly audit the bleeding corporate treasury accounts. Arthur Vance, my oldest operating director, hesitantly raised his hand to voice a legitimate concern regarding the massive financial loss of the proposed Vanguard discount. Stephanie instantly cut him off, her tone dripping with venomous condescension. She firmly reminded Arthur that she was now the undisputed majority shareholder, controlling 70% of the total voting power. She explicitly threatened to replace any dissenting board members with her own compliant proxies if they attempted to block the expedited liquidation process. The room fell entirely silent. The board members lowered their heads, intimidated into absolute submission by her total legal corporate dominance. Having successfully silenced the corporate directors, Stephanie turned her predatory focus directly toward the camera, locking eyes with my digital projection. She smiled a sickeningly sweet smile, utilizing the public forum to systematically humiliate me. She patronizingly addressed me by my first name, loudly declaring that my outdated conservative business strategies were no longer welcome in her modern corporate vision. She openly mocked my current residence at the cheap motel, suggesting that the board allocate a minuscule monthly stipend to ensure I would not end up completely homeless. Every single word was carefully weaponized to inflate her massive, arrogant ego. I forced my hands to tremble visibly in front of the camera lens, playing my pathetic role to absolute perfection. I intentionally let my voice crack, sounding frail and thoroughly exhausted as I spoke through the cheap microphone. I begged her not to dismantle the specific commercial buildings that my son had dedicated his final years to designing. I pleaded for the preservation of our family legacy, offering a desperate, pathetic display of total surrender. The more I groveled, the brighter her triumphant smile became. She was eagerly drinking the intoxicating poison of her own incredibly unchecked ultimate corporate power. Stephanie callously muted my audio feed, abruptly cutting off my desperate pleas in front of the entire stunned boardroom. She proudly declared the liquidation motion, passed by majority executive override, completely dismissing standard voting protocols. She instructed the legal department to immediately draft the final binding contracts with Vanguard Holdings. As the video feed permanently terminated, plunging my computer screen into absolute darkness, I finally stopped trembling. A cold, genuine smile slowly spread across my face in the quiet motel room. She had swallowed the bait, entirely blinded by sheer arrogance, unaware she engineered her own spectacular, inescapable legal destruction. The heavy oak doors of the executive suite swung open on the video feed, interrupting the suffocating silence of the boardroom. An independent state notary public, accompanied by a senior corporate compliance officer, wheeled a stainless steel cart into the room. Resting on the top shelf was a massive stack of thick, watermarked federal documents. Stephanie adjusted her posture, smoothing the lapels of her crimson designer suit. She instantly dropped her aggressive demeanor, adopting a mask of solemn responsibility for the official recording cameras that the compliance officer was now activating in the corners of the room. The compliance officer distributed the paperwork across the polished mahogany table. He explicitly identified the primary dossier as Internal Revenue Service Form 706, the United States Estate Tax Return, paired directly with the Securities and Exchange Commission Schedule 13D. These were the ultimate instruments of corporate dominion. By affixing her signature to these specific pages, Stephanie would formally declare herself the undisputed majority shareholder of Mitchell Estate Developers. She would legally absorb the entirety of the 70% equity stake, completely bypassing standard probate delays through a rapid executive transfer protocol. The notary stepped forward, holding a silver digital recording device to log the verbal consent. He read the mandatory federal warning aloud, his voice echoing clearly through my cheap motel speakers. He stated that any misrepresentation of assets, hidden liabilities, or falsification regarding the origin of the funds used to settle the estate taxes constituted a severe federal offense. He specifically emphasized the phrase, "under strict penalty of perjury," reminding everyone present that the Department of Justice actively audited transfers exceeding $50 million. Stephanie did not flinch at the threat of federal imprisonment. She reached into her tailored jacket and produced a heavy custom-engraved gold fountain pen. Without bothering to review the intricate legal clauses or consult the firm's retaining counsel. Sitting silently beside her, she uncapped the pen. I watched her hand glide smoothly across the bottom of the first page. The scratch of the metal nib against the thick parchment was audible through the microphone, a sharp, rhythmic sound sealing a spectacular lie into the permanent Federal Registry. My encrypted cellular phone vibrated twice inside my pocket, indicating an incoming secure transmission. I kept my eyes fixed on the computer monitor, watching Stephanie flip to the second batch of documents, while I covertly slid the device into the palm of my hand under the desk. It was a direct encrypted text message from Derek Shaw. He had successfully breached the peripheral monitoring firewall of the Bahamian banking registry. The digital trap we had carefully engineered was currently detecting live activity on the offshore accounts. The compliance officer presented the final critical hurdle of the morning. Before the SEC documents could be legally ratified and filed, the outstanding federal estate tax had to be cleared immediately. The assessed tax burden for the rapid transfer of the corporate shares amounted to exactly $4.2 million. The officer slid a secure digital banking terminal across the table, requiring Stephanie to input the routing information for an immediate, permanent wire transfer directly to the United States Treasury. The remaining board members leaned forward, their expressions a mixture of awe and fear. They were witnessing a supposedly grieving widow effortlessly produce over $4 million in liquid cash, utterly unaware that the wealth she was flaunting was actually the stolen lifeblood of their own corporate expansion fund. Stephanie typed a complex sequence of alphanumeric characters into the terminal. She did not use a domestic bank routing number. Instead, she manually entered the international SWIFT codes linked directly to the shadowy offshore proxy server. A third vibration pulsed against my palm. Derek sent a rapid succession of digital screenshots. The offshore shell corporation, Apex Zenith LLC, had just initiated a massive outbound wire transfer. The funds were instantly crossing international borders, bouncing through a sanitized clearinghouse in Zurich, and landing directly in the IRS Federal Depository. By using the embezzled millions to pay the government tax, she was officially laundering the stolen corporate capital through the United States Treasury itself. Another message flashed on my encrypted screen, this time from my corporate attorney, Tom Becker. It contained a single decisive word: checkmate. The legal threshold of a civil dispute had just been obliterated. The second that stolen money touched American soil to satisfy her personal tax liability, Stephanie committed a major federal felony. Every document she just signed was now a glowing, irrefutable confession of wire fraud, tax evasion, and perjury, perfectly packaged for a federal prosecutor, oblivious to the invisible noose tightening around her neck. Stephanie signed the final SEC transfer affidavit. She confidently lifted the stamped document, holding it directly toward the webcam lens so I could see the blue notary seal. Her eyes gleamed with absolute toxic triumph. She formally declared to the silent room that she was now the absolute owner of the empire, wielding unchecked executive authority over every single asset, property, and employee within the organization. Without consulting the financial committee, Stephanie announced the immediate termination of the employee pension matching program. Arthur Vance, the oldest director on the board, slammed his fist onto the mahogany table in outrage. He vehemently protested the severe ethical violations. Stephanie did not raise her voice. She simply pointed her gold pen at Arthur and terminated his employment, effective immediately. She ordered the securities guards to physically escort him out of the building. The brutal firing completely paralyzed the room. Stephanie turned her predatory gaze back to the webcam, focusing her triumphant malice entirely on my digital projection. She commanded the IT director to permanently revoke my administrative access. A red countdown timer suddenly appeared on my monitor. I offered zero protest. I did not beg nor show the fake sorrow I had projected earlier. I simply stared back with cold serenity. I manually clicked disconnect, terminating the feed before her timer reached zero. The trap was perfectly set. The valet at the Rainier Golf and Country Club hesitated for a fraction of a second before taking the keys to my rented sedan. The sweeping circular driveway was choked with imported European sports cars and armored black SUVs belonging to Seattle's aristocratic elite. Spotlights illuminated the manicured hedges, casting long, dramatic shadows across the marble entrance. A massive silk banner hung above the portico, declaring the evening as the Mitchell Visionary Gala, conspicuously omitting the word memorial. The crisp night air carried the faint rhythmic pulse of a string quartet playing inside. I stepped through the gilded double doors wearing a vintage midnight blue bespoke suit. It was the exact garment I had commissioned in London 30 years ago to celebrate my very first commercial skyscraper acquisition. The heavy wool fabric draped perfectly across my shoulders, demanding a physical posture of absolute unyielding authority. The young hostess at the reception podium frantically scanned her embossed guest ledger, her eyes widening when she recognized my face. She nervously whispered into a hidden earpiece, lacking the courage to physically block the company's original founder. Inside the ballroom, the sheer scale of the financial hemorrhage was breathtaking. Waiters in white tuxedos circulated with silver trays bearing beluga caviar and vintage champagne. Two towering ice sculptures carved into the shape of soaring falcons flanked a massive chocolate fountain. Stephanie was holding court near the center of the room, flanked by the deputy mayor and a prominent state senator. She wore a backless emerald green silk gown, a diamond tiara resting heavily in her updo, exuding the predatory confidence of a newly crowned queen surveying her conquered territory. She was aggressively pitching a radical new urban development initiative to the captivated politicians. I caught fragments of her sharp, ambitious voice, outlining the immediate demolition of our historic downtown properties to construct high-density luxury condominiums. She was actively auctioning off the architectural soul of the firm to secure lucrative municipal tax breaks. The local elite nodded along enthusiastically, mesmerized by her glamorous presentation and the promise of unbridled profit. Hovering just at the edge of her elite circle was Carter Jenkins. He had swapped his holistic clinic attire for a velvet dinner jacket, shamelessly handing out embossed gold business cards to the wives of the corporate executives. He pitched himself as an exclusive grief counselor and elite wellness guru, using his connection to the tragic widow to rapidly climb the social ladder. His arrogant, practiced smile flashed constantly as he secured private appointments with Seattle's wealthiest, most vulnerable socialites. Stephanie's gaze swept across the room and locked onto mine. For a fleeting millisecond, shock registered on her face, swiftly replaced by a cold, calculating sneer. She snapped her fingers at the head of private security, a hulking man with a coiled earpiece. He immediately marched toward me, effectively cutting off my path to the main floor. With a rigid, practiced motion, the guard aggressively redirected me toward a shadowy, secluded corner. I was forced into a seat at a cramped, wobbly cocktail table, situated dangerously close to the swinging kitchen doors. The placement was a deliberate public insult, entirely isolated from the wealthy dignitaries. Seated across from me was Marcus Thorne, our former head of architectural preservation, looking deeply uncomfortable in a frayed suit. He nervously leaned forward, revealing that Stephanie had officially terminated the entire preservation department via an automated corporate email earlier. A sudden drum roll from the grand stage silenced the overlapping chatter. The heavy velvet curtains revealing a colossal, freshly painted portrait measuring at least 10 feet high. It did not depict my deceased son. Instead, the canvas showcased Stephanie standing heroically against the Seattle skyline holding a rolled blueprint. The company's iconic cornerstone logo had been aggressively painted over, replaced by a sleek, modernized crest bearing only her maiden initials. Richard Sterling, the regional director of a major national bank, detached himself from the VIP section and strolled over to my isolated table. He offered a condescending, pitying smile, clapping a heavy hand on my shoulder. He quietly bragged that Stephanie had just finalized a preliminary application for a $70 million personal line of credit. She was using the entirety of the firm's unencumbered commercial real estate portfolio as direct collateral, intending to funnel the massive loan into offshore private equity ventures. Carter Jenkins confidently climbed the mahogany stairs to the main stage, tapping the microphone to command absolute silence. His introduction dripped with nauseating theatrical reverence. He painted a fictitious narrative of a brave, visionary woman stepping out of the shadows of a tragically outdated family dynasty. He explicitly labeled Stephanie as the ultimate savior of Mitchell estate developers, a brilliant modern leader rescuing a stagnant, dying empire from total irrelevance. The crowd erupted into enthusiastic applause as Stephanie glided up to the podium, basking in the blinding glare of the photographer's flashbulbs. She adjusted the microphone, letting a perfectly timed sigh echo through the speakers. She officially announced the immediate rebranding of the event. It was no longer a memorial gathering, but rather the exclusive launch party for Zenith Global Holdings, legally burying the Mitchell name. Her eyes found my shadowy corner once again gleaming with malicious intent. She raised her hand, commanding the lighting technician to swing a harsh, blinding spotlight directly onto my face. The entire ballroom turned to stare at the isolated table by the kitchen. With a sickeningly sweet tone, she publicly declared a generous charitable donation in my honor to the Sunset Pines Assisted Living Facility, framing it as my final destination. The suffocating silence was heavy with second-hand embarrassment. The aristocrats waited for the broken old man to wither under the intense humiliation. Instead, I calmly pushed my chair back and stood up. The vintage wool of my bespoke suit caught the spotlight, radiating an undeniable, intimidating elegance. I deliberately buttoned the center button of my jacket, locking my jaw into a granite stare, absolutely ready to finally strike. The valet at the Rainier Golf and Country Club hesitated before approaching my rented sedan. The sprawling circular driveway was entirely choked with European sports cars and black SUVs belonging to Seattle's aristocratic elite. Spotlights illuminated the manicured hedges, casting long, dramatic shadows across the marble entrance. A massive silk banner hung above the portico, boldly declaring the evening as the Mitchell Visionary Gala. The word memorial was conspicuously absent. The crisp night air carried the faint rhythmic pulse of a string quartet playing inside the grand hall. I stepped through those double doors, wearing a vintage midnight blue bespoke suit. It was the exact garment I had commissioned in London 30 years ago to celebrate my first commercial skyscraper acquisition. The heavy wool fabric draped flawlessly across my shoulders, demanding a physical posture of absolute, unyielding authority. The hostess at the reception podium frantically scanned her embossed guest ledger, her eyes widening when she recognized my face. She nervously whispered into an earpiece, lacking the courage to physically block the company's original founder from entering the venue. Inside the ballroom, the sheer scale of the financial hemorrhage was breathtaking. Waiters in white tuxedos circulated smoothly, with silver trays bearing beluga caviar and champagne. Two towering ice sculptures carved into the shape of soaring falcons flanked a chocolate fountain near the dance floor. Hovering just at the edge of the VIP circle was Carter Jenkins. He had swapped his holistic clinic attire for a velvet dinner jacket, shamelessly handing out embossed gold business cards to the wives of prominent corporate executives. Stephanie was holding court near the center of the room, flanked by the deputy mayor and a prominent state senator. She wore a backless green silk gown, a diamond tiara resting heavily in her updo, exuding the predatory confidence of a newly crowned queen surveying her conquered territory. She was aggressively pitching a radical new urban development initiative to the politicians. I caught fragments of her sharp, ambitious voice, outlining the immediate demolition of downtown properties to construct high-density luxury condominiums. Her sweeping gaze swept across the room and locked directly onto mine. For a fleeting millisecond, genuine shock registered on her face, swiftly replaced by a cold, calculating sneer. She snapped her fingers at the head of private security, a hulking man with a coiled earpiece. With a rigid, practiced motion, the guard aggressively redirected me away from the shadows and toward a highly visible, isolated cocktail table situated directly in front of the main stage. The placement was a deliberate public insult, entirely isolated from the wealthy dignitaries, yet perfectly illuminated for everyone to observe. Seated a few tables away was Marcus Thorne, our former head of architectural preservation. He nervously leaned forward, quickly averting his eyes in deep shame. He had clearly already sworn allegiance to the new regime out of sheer panic over his corporate pension. A sudden drumroll from the grand stage abruptly silenced the overlapping chatter of the wealthy guests. The heavy velvet curtains parted, revealing a colossal, freshly painted portrait, measuring at least 10 feet high. It showcased Stephanie standing heroically against the Seattle skyline holding a rolled blueprint. Carter Jenkins confidently climbed the mahogany stairs to the main stage, tapping the microphone to command absolute silence from the intoxicated crowd. His introduction dripped with nauseating theatrical reverence. He painted a fictitious narrative of a brave, visionary woman stepping out of the shadows of a tragically outdated family dynasty. He explicitly labeled Stephanie as the ultimate savior of Mitchell estate developers. The crowd erupted into enthusiastic applause as Stephanie glided gracefully up to the podium, basking blindly in the blinding glare of the photographer's flashing bulbs. She adjusted the microphone stand, letting a perfectly timed dramatic sigh echo through the towering speakers. She began a tearful, entirely fabricated speech about Bradley. She weaponized his sudden passing using corporate buzzwords to turn a devastating human tragedy into a slick public relations narrative. She explicitly claimed that his final dying wish was for her to aggressively modernize the stagnant portfolio and aggressively liquidate the underperforming physical assets, drying her invisible crocodile tears with a lace handkerchief. She shifted her tone instantly to bright, toxic optimism. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my illuminated table. Her voice echoed through the vast ballroom, adopting the patronizing, sickeningly sweet cadence one might use to address a confused toddler. She loudly detailed my supposed extreme physical exhaustion and rapidly declining mental fragility. She explicitly claimed the heavy burden of the company was simply too much for my failing senile mind to comprehend anymore. An assistant rushed onto the stage carrying a small velvet presentation box. Stephanie proudly announced to the silent room that she was officially retiring, the beloved founder effective immediately. She dramatically opened the box to reveal the ultimate calculated insult. It was a cheap, generic plastic digital watch, the kind sold at discount drugstores. She walked slowly down the carpeted steps of the grand stage, approaching my isolated table, while the spotlights tracked her every single movement. She shoved the worthless plastic timepiece directly into my hands. Leaning closely into the wireless microphone she held, she offered her final devastating public blow. She loudly suggested that it was past time for me to move into the Sunset Pines assisted living facility, mockingly offering to pay my first month's rent out of her own pocket. The entire ballroom fell completely, terrifyingly silent. The elite aristocrats shifted uncomfortably in their expensive, tailored suits, suddenly realizing they were witnessing a brutal, unprovoked public execution of a respected Seattle business legend. I sat perfectly still, feeling the cold, rigid weight of the cheap plastic watch pressing against my calloused palms. I did not flinch. I did not yell. I looked directly up into Stephanie's triumphant, arrogant eyes. I deliberately buttoned the center button of my vintage bespoke jacket, locking my jaw into a granite stare, absolutely ready to unleash the devastating legal apocalypse upon her stolen empire. I did not raise my voice or throw the cheap plastic watch back at her. Instead, I calmly stepped forward and slipped the microphone directly out of Stephanie's trembling fingers. The sudden feedback whine pierced the silent ballroom, causing several front-row aristocrats to flinch and cover their ears. I unbuttoned my vintage jacket with deliberate slowness and pulled a sleek black leather folder from my inner breast pocket. I handed a small USB drive to the bewildered audio-visual technician standing near the stage stairs. I instructed him to immediately plug the device into the main projection system overhead. The massive screen behind the stage flickered brightly, instantly, replacing her giant, heroic portrait with a crisp, high-resolution scan of a dense legal document. The header displayed the official seal of the United States Federal Estate Court, dated 3 decades ago. Gasps rippled through the crowd as prominent corporate attorneys in the audience squinted, adjusting their glasses to read the complex text. Carter Jenkins took a nervous step backward, his arrogant smile melting into absolute confusion as he stared at the bold black lettering. The room waited in breathless anticipation for my next calculated and devastating verbal strike tonight. You invited me here to publicly announce my forced retirement, I said, my voice projecting with absolute clarity through the expensive speakers. You wanted to prove your dominance over my empire in front of Seattle elite citizens. However, you made a monumental miscalculation regarding the fundamental architecture of my company. Stephanie lunged forward, trying to snatch the microphone away, but I easily sidestepped her clumsy grasp. She stumbled awkwardly in her emerald gown, nearly tripping over the thick audio cables taped to the carpeted floor. I turned my attention back to the fascinated, paralyzed audience watching this spectacle unfold rapidly. This document governs 70% of Mitchell estate developers and the Mercer Island mansion. I continued, functioning as a highly specialized legal instrument known as a bloodline generation skipping trust. The deputy mayor, standing near the chocolate fountain, widened his eyes in sudden comprehension. This specific type of trust is explicitly designed by elite estate planners to ensure that generational wealth remains strictly within direct biological descendants. It creates an impenetrable fortress around the family assets, shielding them completely from external spouses or hostile corporate takeover attempts, like yours, unfolding before our very eyes on this grand stage tonight, Stephanie. Stephanie signaled frantically to her head of private security, demanding he remove me from the stage immediately. The hulking guard stepped forward, but my attorney Tom Becker emerged from the shadows and flashed a federal injunction directly in the man's face. The guard read the court order, nodded slowly, and backed away, leaving the fake widow completely defenseless. I pointed at the projected document, specifically highlighting paragraph 4 for the entire room to analyze. My finger traced the dense legal jargon that was about to ruin her stolen empire and shatter her grand delusions of wealth and absolute power today. This trust contains an ironclad reversionary clause, I explained, making sure every single syllable echoed with lethal precision. It dictates that if the primary beneficiary passes away before producing a verified biological heir, the entirety of the estate does not transfer to their surviving spouse. Instead, every single asset, instantly and automatically, reverts back to the original grantor. I paused to let the massive implications sink into her mind. Because my beloved son died childless, your marriage certificate is rendered completely void regarding all corporate holdings and all associated real estate properties owned by our Mitchell family business empire forever. Stephanie dropped her jaw entirely, her face draining of all color until she looked like a porcelain doll about to shatter. "That is a lie," she screamed, abandoning her polished public relations persona entirely. I signed the federal tax declarations. I filed the transfer documents with the government board. I am the majority shareholder. I own 70% of this company. Her voice cracked hysterically, echoing off the crystal chandeliers above. Several wealthy guests began whispering frantically to each other, realizing they were witnessing the spectacular downfall of a fraudulent socialite who had just humiliated herself here completely public tonight. You signed fraudulent documents for assets that were never legally yours to claim, I replied, my tone dropping to a freezing whisper that commanded absolute silence across the vast room. The exact second Bradley tragically passed away, the trust was automatically executed without requiring probate approval. 100% of the company shares the liquid cash reserves, the commercial portfolio, and the mansion you currently sleep in reverted back to my sole ownership. You do not own the business. You do not own the house. You own absolutely nothing but the lies you have told everyone gathered here tonight, Stephanie. Carter Jenkins suddenly realized the gravitas of the situation and attempted to slip quietly toward the ballroom exit. He abandoned his lover without a second thought, prioritizing his own cowardly survival. Stephanie watched him flee, her eyes wide with betrayal and rising panic. She looked back at the screen, then down at her diamond necklace, finally understanding that she had walked blindly into a meticulously designed slaughterhouse. The elite guests who had applauded her mockery minutes earlier, now stared at her with open disgust and profound contempt for her brazen greed and her arrogant stupidity tonight in this very room. I stepped closer to her, ensuring the microphone captured my final words for the historical record. "You publicly handed me a cheap watch and told me my time was up," I stated coldly, dropping the plastic timepiece onto the wooden stage floor and crushing it under my leather shoe. "But I am the founder of this legacy, and I decide when the clock stops. You are officially evicted from my property, terminated from my company, and entirely bankrupt. The game is over. I have taken back everything you tried to steal." I smiled darkly. "And we are just getting started." The collective gasp from the ballroom floor sucked the remaining oxygen out of the massive space. Hundreds of Seattle's wealthiest aristocrats stared at the projected reversionary clause, their champagne glasses frozen in midair. The aristocratic elite who mere minutes ago had applauded her cruel mockery now looked at Stephanie with unmasked revulsion. Her meticulously constructed empire of lies was disintegrating under the blinding glare of the stage spotlights. The devastating legal reality stripped away her unearned royal status, reducing her to a common fraudster standing, humiliated before the exact high society she desperately craved to rule. Stephanie stumbled backward, the heels of her designer shoes catching on the microphone cables. She stared at the projection screen as if the legal text were written in a foreign, terrifying language. Her breathing turned jagged, chest heaving violently beneath the emerald silk gown. Realizing the public humiliation was absolute, she abandoned her polished public relations persona entirely. She lunged toward me completely disregarding the audience and pressed her face close to mine. Shielding her mouth from the audio equipment with her trembling hand, she unleashed her final desperate contingency plan in a venomous, hushed tone. "Keep the company, you pathetic old man," she hissed, her voice vibrating with a toxic mixture of panic and residual arrogance. "You think this changes anything? I still have the $15 million sitting safely in the Cayman Islands. I have my passport in my purse, and my private jet is waiting on the tarmac at Boeing Field. I am leaving the country tonight, and there is absolutely nothing you can do to stop me from living like a queen while you rot in this miserable city." I did not flinch at her vicious threat. Instead, I let a terrifying ice-cold smile spread slowly across my face. I looked down at her desperate, sweating visage, feeling the absolute power of the predator who had successfully cornered its prey. I leaned in slightly, ensuring my voice was low enough for only her ears to capture. "I think you need to check your phone right now, Stephanie," I whispered, maintaining unbroken, unyielding eye contact. "Check the secure banking application you use to manage Apex Zenith LLC." Confusion momentarily paralyzed her features. She frantically reached into her sequined clutch and pulled out her encrypted mobile device. Her manicured thumb swiped across the biometric scanner with frantic urgency. The bright screen illuminated her pale face, casting a ghastly blue glow over her terrified expression. Instead of the familiar offshore banking dashboard displaying her stolen millions, a glaring red notification banner dominated the entire digital display. Her mouth fell open in a silent scream as she read the terrifying federal alert flashing relentlessly across the glass. The automated message from the International Clearinghouse confirmed her absolute financial ruin. The United States Department of Justice had executed an emergency global freeze on all assets associated with Apex Zenith LLC. Every single offshore account, every hidden proxy trust, and every digital wallet tied to her Bahamian shell corporation was now locked under federal mandate. The $15 million she had brutally murdered my son to secure was completely inaccessible, seized by the government, pending a massive international criminal investigation. "You honestly thought I spent the last few weeks hiding in a cheap motel doing absolutely nothing?" I asked, my voice slicing through her mounting hysteria. I handed the unencrypted backup hard drive, the midnight wire transfer logs, and the audio recording of your final argument with Bradley directly to the FBI weeks ago. "The federal agents have been quietly building a massive RICO and wire fraud indictment in the background while you were busy shopping for diamond necklaces and planning this ridiculous vanity gala." The realization of her monumental mistake began to crush her physical posture. I explained the fatal mechanism of the perjury trap she had willingly walked into earlier that morning. By using the embezzled corporate funds to pay her fabricated federal estate taxes, she had officially laundered the stolen money through the United States Treasury. That single arrogant action provided the federal prosecutors with the irrefutable, ironclad jurisdictional authority required to immediately freeze the Cayman accounts and seize her illicit overseas assets without requiring international extradition warrants. Her eyes darted wildly toward the ballroom exit, her survival instinct finally overriding her shock. She took a step toward the mahogany stairs, desperate to flee the country before the authorities arrived. "Do not bother running for the airport," I commanded, stopping her dead in her tracks. "The charter company operating your private jet to St. Bart's received a federal grounding order 30 minutes ago. The pilot has been instructed to surrender the flight manifest, and your passport has been electronically flagged and revoked by the State Department." Stephanie began to hyperventilate, her manicured hands clutching the heavy diamond necklace around her throat, as if it were actively strangling her. "Enjoy wearing that Cartier piece tonight," I told her, my tone devoid of any mercy. "Under the civil asset forfeiture laws, that jewelry, the designer gown you are currently wearing, and the luxury vehicle you drove here in are now officially classified as the direct proceeds of felony money laundering. The government owns the clothes on your back, Stephanie. You are completely and utterly bankrupt." The magnitude of her absolute defeat broke her. Stephanie collapsed onto her knees on the polished wooden stage, the emerald silk pooling around her trembling body. She wept uncontrollably, but these were no longer the calculated theatrical tears she weaponized at my son's funeral. This was the raw, guttural sobbing of a trapped predator realizing its inescapable doom. The elite crowd below watched her humiliating unraveling in dead, unforgiving silence. No one rushed forward to offer comfort. She was completely isolated, surrounded by the flashing cameras of the high society. She tried to manipulate. I stood over her shivering form, adjusting the cuffs of my vintage suit, savoring the absolute destruction of the monster who violently destroyed my family. The primal instinct of a cornered animal finally overtook the paralyzing shock holding Stephanie against the polished wooden floorboards. She scrambled upward with a frantic, uncoordinated thrashing of her limbs, her expensive stiletto heels slipping uselessly against the varnished mahogany stage. The sharp movement caught the delicate hem of her custom emerald silk gown beneath her own shoe, tearing the designer fabric with a loud, violent rip that echoed through the stunned ballroom. She did not care about the ruined garment. Her manicured fingers clawed at the air as she violently shoved past the bewildered audiovisual technician standing near the stage stairs. Abandoning every ounce of her carefully cultivated high society grace, she bolted directly toward the massive brass-handled double doors at the far end of the grand hall. She moved with the chaotic, reckless speed of a fugitive, her chest heaving as she sucked in desperate gasps of the caviar-scented air. "Carter!" she shrieked, the sound tearing from her throat in a raw, guttural pitch that sounded entirely inhuman. "Carter, start the car." She blindly assumed her holistic pharmacist lover was waiting in the valet queue, ready to execute an emergency extraction. She shoved a towering floral arrangement out of her path, sending dozens of white orchids scattering across the expensive Persian rugs. The wealthy aristocrats, politicians, and corporate executives physically recoiled from her parting like the Red Sea. No one offered a helping hand. Instead, they actively pulled their silk dresses and tailored tuxedo jackets away to avoid any physical contact with a radioactive felon. A terrified waiter dropped a silver tray of champagne flutes, the crystal shattering into 100 glittering shards right in her path. She ran straight through the broken glass, ignoring the sharp crunches beneath her torn shoes. I did not pursue her. I remained anchored to the center of the stage, a solitary figure illuminated by the harsh spotlight. I calmly lifted the wireless microphone back to my lips, adjusting my grip on the cool metal cylinder. My voice, amplified by the towering concert speakers flanking the stage, hit her back like a physical shockwave, freezing her desperate sprint, just 10 yards shy of the exit. "If you are screaming for Carter Jenkins, you are wasting your breath." I announced, my tone stripped of all emotion, delivering the surgical strike with absolute precision. "He is not waiting in the valet line. He is currently sitting in a windowless federal interrogation room." Stephanie stopped dead in her tracks, her shoulders hunching defensively. She slowly turned around her chest, heaving mascara running down her pale cheeks in dark, jagged rivers. "The FBI apprehended your partner exactly 3 hours ago at Concourse D of the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport." I detailed to the breathless crowd, ensuring every single aristocrat understood the full scope of the conspiracy. "He was attempting to board a commercial flight to Nassau with a duffel bag stuffed with untraceable bearer bonds. He did not make it past the TSA security checkpoint." A new wave of panicked murmurs rippled through the audience. Stephanie opened her mouth, but only a dry, breathless wheeze escaped. When the federal agents placed the handcuffs on his wrists, Carter did not invoke his right to an attorney. I continued savoring the absolute destruction of her final hope. "He immediately folded. He traded your freedom for it at a reduced sentence. He handed the Department of Justice the exact lot numbers, the encrypted supply chain logs, and the dark web procurement receipts." I paused, letting the silence stretch until it was agonizing before delivering the killing blow. "He signed a full sworn confession detailing exactly how he procured the highly regulated synthetic succinylcholine, the exact paralytic compound you systematically poured into my son's evening drink to murder him." The word murder seemed to suck the atmospheric pressure entirely out of the room. Several socialites screamed. The deputy mayor instinctively stepped behind a marble column, putting a physical barrier between himself and the exposed killer. Stephanie swayed on her feet, the blood draining from her face so completely that her skin took on a translucent, ghostly pallor. The delusion of her simple financial escape evaporated, replaced by the terrifying, suffocating reality of a lethal injection gurney or a lifetime in a maximum security federal penitentiary, before she could take another step toward the exit. The massive brass handles of the ballroom double doors violently turned from the outside. The heavy oak portals exploded inward with bone-rattling force, slamming against the interior walls. A perfectly synchronized tactical unit poured into the opulent space. Over a dozen FBI special agents and Seattle Police Department detectives swarmed the grand hall. They wore heavy dark Kevlar vests prominently emblazoned with bright yellow federal acronyms, their duty belts clattering with handcuffs and radios. The brutal, militaristic intrusion instantly shattered the fragile illusion of the high society gala. "Federal agents, nobody move!" The lead detective roared, his voice cutting through the ambient chaos with absolute trained authority. He pointed a rigid finger directly at the woman standing paralyzed in the torn emerald gown. "Stephanie Mitchell. Put your hands where I can see them immediately." The survival instinct kicked in one final pathetic time. Stephanie let out a feral, ear-piercing shriek and wildly swung her arms, attempting to strike the nearest approaching federal agent. She twisted her body, trying to bolt towards the catering kitchens. She did not make it 2 feet. 2 heavily armored detectives intercepted her frantic charge. They moved with practiced, unyielding efficiency. One agent grabbed her flailing right arm, twisting it forcefully behind her back, while the other seized her left shoulder. The sheer momentum of their interception drove her violently forward, slamming her upper body directly into the extravagant culinary display table. The impact was spectacular. The towering, majestic ice sculptures of soaring falcons toppled backward, shattering into massive, jagged blocks of frozen water across the imported carpets. Silver bowls of beluga caviar and towers of imported artisan cheeses crashed to the floor, splattering across her expensive designer dress. She writhed against the cold, wet tablecloth, screaming obscenities and wild, incoherent denials into the spilled champagne. The sharp, unmistakable metallic click of a steel handcuff ratcheting tightly around her left wrist echoed sharply. A second click instantly followed, permanently binding her hands together behind her back. "You have the right to remain silent," the lead FBI agent recited loudly, his voice completely devoid of sympathy as he hauled her upright from the ruined buffet. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." They dragged her aggressively toward the shattered ballroom entrance. She thrashed her legs, digging her heels into the carpet, forcing the detectives to physically lift her off the ground. The elite crowd of Seattle, the very people she had desperately tried to impress and rule, now crowded around the perimeter of the chaos. Hundreds of smartphones were raised high in the air. The bright, relentless flashes of their device cameras illuminated her tear-streaked, caviar-smeared face, digitally immortalizing her absolute ruin for the entire world to witness. I stood perfectly still on the stage, watching the heavy doors finally swing shut, behind the screaming murderer, savoring the silent, freezing peace that immediately followed the storm. The late May sun broke through the Seattle canopy, casting warm golden rays across the manicured lawns of the Oakwood Memorial Park. I stood silently before two polished marble headstones, set side by side beneath a sprawling, weeping willow. 6 months had passed since I last stood on this exact plot of earth. The bitter, freezing rain that had soaked my coat during my son's burial was completely gone, replaced by a crisp, refreshing spring breeze. The heavy, suffocating weight that had crushed my chest for half a year finally dissolved into the bright afternoon air. I reached out and gently brushed a fallen leaf from Diane's engraved name, then moved my hand to trace the deep, pristine lettering of Bradley's monument. Yesterday morning, the federal courthouse downtown delivered the ultimate, irrevocable finality to our family's nightmare. United States District Judge Harrison dropped his heavy wooden gavel, formally sentencing Stephanie and Carter Jenkins to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. They were convicted on multiple counts of first-degree murder, interstate wire fraud, and severe financial exploitation. I sat in the front row of the gallery, watching the heavy steel doors of the holding cell permanently close behind them. There were no dramatic outbursts or desperate pleas for mercy. The overwhelming mountain of forensic evidence and digital paper trails had completely crushed their high-priced defense team. They will spend the rest of their natural lives rotting in maximum security isolation, entirely erased from society. The Department of Justice worked with unprecedented efficiency to unravel the complex international laundering scheme. Just 3 days ago, the Federal Asset Forfeiture Division officially released the frozen offshore accounts. I sat in my downtown executive suite and watched the digital banking ledger update in real time as exactly $15 million was repatriated directly from the Bahamian shell company back to Mitchell Estate developers. The stolen capital was fully recovered, but I knew instantly that I could never pump that specific money back into commercial real estate acquisitions. That capital carried the heavy, unforgivable price of my son's blood, and it required a completely different, much higher purpose. I officially retook the helm of the company as the active chief executive officer, immediately implementing a radical corporate restructuring. I promoted Tom Becker to the board of directors and established a sweeping new dual verification security protocol for all financial transfers, ensuring no rogue executive could ever bypass the system again. We completely dissolved the public relations department Stephanie had weaponized, redirecting that entire annual budget toward an internal employee wellness and legal protection program. The firm is thriving under this renewed, transparent leadership, securing 3 major municipal contracts this quarter alone. But my personal focus has shifted entirely away from building skyscrapers and acquiring luxury portfolios. With the recovered $15 million acting as the primary endowment, I officially chartered a brand new philanthropic organization, the Bradley Mitchell Foundation. We acquired a highly secure 3-story brick building in the downtown legal district to serve as our permanent operational headquarters. I hired Derek Shaw to lead a specialized investigative branch, transitioning his private agency into a full-time, fully funded division of the charity. The foundation operates with a singular, aggressive mandate: designed to prevent the exact tragedy that destroyed my family from ever happening to another unsuspecting victim. The first pillar of our organization, finances, independent full-spectrum, toxicological screenings for families who suspect foul play in sudden, unexplained medical deaths. We partner directly with elite private forensic laboratories, completely bypassing the slow bureaucratic red tape of county morgues to preserve rapidly degrading biological evidence. We also launched a legislative lobbying arm actively pushing for the Bradley Act, a proposed state law requiring mandatory secondary chemical screens in cases of unexpected cardiac events in healthy adults under 50. The second pillar provides ruthless, high-tier legal representation, completely free of charge, to elderly and vulnerable individuals actively suffering from domestic financial abuse. We employ a team of aggressive corporate litigators who specialize in dismantling fraudulent guardianships, recovering embezzled family estates, and prosecuting predatory relatives. The Foundation is already executing its mission with lethal efficiency. Just this morning, our legal team successfully secured an emergency injunction that froze the assets of a manipulative nephew attempting to evict his widowed aunt from her lifelong home. Using the exact same aggressive legal tactics Tom and I deployed 6 months ago, we halted the illegal property transfer and initiated federal fraud charges against the abuser. Knowing that Bradley's name is now permanently attached to an organization actively saving lives and destroying predators brings a profound, untouchable peace to my soul. His tragic death was not the end of his legacy. It became the catalyst for a massive shield protecting the innocent across the entire state. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit and pulled out a freshly printed architectural blueprint. It was not a schematic for a commercial high-rise or a luxury condominium. It was the finalized floor plan for the Foundation's new investigative laboratory annex. I carefully unfolded the thick paper and placed it gently against the base of my son's marble headstone. I didn't need to speak any words aloud. The silent spiritual communion between a father and his family transcended spoken language. I stood in the quiet warmth of the cemetery, feeling Diane's comforting presence and Bradley's enduring pride wrapping around me like a protective cloak. I checked my watch, noting a scheduled afternoon meeting with a new team of paralegals joining the Foundation. I adjusted my collar, offered a final respectful nod to the graves, and turned toward the winding cobblestone path leading back to my parked car. I walked with a steady, powerful stride, no longer the broken, weeping old man, hiding in the shadows of a rainy funeral. The Mitchell empire is fully secure, the predators have been permanently caged, and the bloodline's honor shines brighter than ever before. The wolf had protected his pack, and now he was finally at peace. Life has a brutal way of revealing the true faces of the people we let into our homes. I learned at 70 years old that greed can turn a seemingly perfect smile into a weapon of murder. But evil thrives only when good men choose to stay blind to the signs. You must never let grief strip you of your instincts. Trust is a privilege that must be earned daily, not blindly handed over through a marriage certificate. When wolves come dressed in sheep's clothing to devour your family, you don't surrender. You remind them why you're the lion. If my story gave you the courage to stand up to the toxic manipulators in your own life, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. Stay strong, trust your gut, and never stop fighting.